Alrighty, hey everyone, it's Michael here, one of the GT iOS Club officers. Today we're going to be talking about animation. I'm really excited for this one because I love animation. It's a really cool concept to include in your iOS apps. And today we're going to be building just a really simple animation gallery. And then the goal of this is to basically show you guys what's capable with iOS animations, what you can implement, and maybe give you some ideas on how to go about doing it. So the app that we're going to be building is a really simple animation gallery. If we go ahead and simulate a pinch to view, the view zooms in the background, and then if you let go, the background blurs, and then there's this view that pops up that lets you say start or cancel. If you click cancel, the view disappears, whereas if you do it again and you click start, the view will take you to this tab bar view where you can test out two types of animations that we're going to be looking at. This sort of translation animation where if you click, the square moves 150 pixels up and down and changes to a random color. So there's two animations going on there. And a simple color animation where you click on the screen and it changes the background color. So that's a quick intro to what we'll be building. But before we get started, I wanted to give like a quick brief overview of animation, just as like a history and like why it's important. So if you guys didn't already know, animation has its roots in basically in history with cartoons. So it kind of started out with cartoons and like really famous ones like Bugs Bunny and the stuff that was happening like back in, I think, early 1800s. People were starting off with animation. And then it progressed into like Looney Tunes and all these really popular animations, and Walt Disney pioneered a lot of stuff. And then eventually it made its way into computers whenever they became popular, and personal computers especially. And it became really, really useful, so much so that they're included in almost every single app that you see that's super popular. And there's a couple of reasons for that. But I think the main one to focus on is that it's visually appealing. Whenever you have an animation, it's visually, aesthetically, it's appealing. And at the same time, it provides a little bit of value to your app. It gives you some sort of spatial awareness for the user. So they can tell like what's exactly going on, what's the flow of your app, and how are they navigating throughout it without like losing place or getting distracted. It sort of adds to the entire experience without distracting, and that's what I wanted to get into. And so basically, some really popular examples you guys have probably seen are in Google Maps and a bunch of other apps out there and Airbnb, especially if you try searching on Airbnb, they have this really nice animation for search. And another example is like an app that I'm building called Dialogue, which is a diabetes tracking app. Just simple animations. Most of these are aesthetic, but you see these little animations that play and they're really aesthetically pleasing. But in addition, they have some sort of relevance to the interface. So for example, when you're tracking your blood sugar, that relates to blood, which is pumped by your heart. And so naturally you put a heart animation there. But there's some other stuff that's actually useful. That's a little bit more aesthetic. It gives a sense of relationship. It provides a semantic relationship for the user so they understand what this thing is just by seeing an image that's moving. But some other more interaction-based stuff is really helpful. So like whenever you're here trying to log your information, if you switch to a different category, it doesn't just jerk. It doesn't just switch and then stop playing or just move really, really abruptly. It smoothly scrolls to that place and it turns on that particular item. Same thing goes for whenever they're logging data. Whenever you click the log, if an error happens, it doesn't just like show up and then become really, really abrupt. There's this nice little sheet that scrolls up from the top and then it disappears from the bottom. And again, that helps with the spatial awareness. It helps the user, whenever they're interacting with your app, make sure they keep a spatial understanding of where all the interface components are. But as well, it doesn't distract them. It doesn't hurt them whenever they're trying to use it. And imagine if you tried doing this and it was just really abrupt, like a jump cut. It would be really abrupt. It kind of confused people if they used it. So you have some utility, but you also have some aesthetic examples of why you should be using animation in your own apps. And the other thing that I want to point out is that Apple actually has what are called human interface guidelines, which are basically the rules that they set out for when you build iOS apps. And they have a great section on animation that I just wanted to briefly go over. You guys can check this out in your own time. But I wanted to briefly go over this. They have kind of 4 guidelines that they like to abide by. whenever developers are making iOS apps. So the first is using animation and motion effects judiciously. You don't want to put animation in your app just for the sake of animation. There has to be a purpose. As you saw in this app, the purpose of having this sort of error animation is to provide the user with information that, hey, you did an error, try and fix it before you continue. You don't just want to throw animations in there for no reason. You could argue that maybe some of these animations at the top with the little icons, the moving icons, might be a little extra. But at the same time, it's your own judgment. You get to decide as the developer whether or not an animation makes sense and it helps the user whenever they're interacting with your app. Second thing, you want to strive for realism and credibility. So again, you don't just want to throw an animation in there that doesn't make sense. If it just like, if you click, if I let's say click on another thing and like a bunch of confetti like starts popping out everywhere, like that doesn't really make sense. But it might make sense if, let's say, you click log and you're successful and then a bunch of confetti, like something positive happens. So there has to be some sort of, realistic addition. If you start defying physics and you start doing things that are really crazy in your animations, it can do more distraction than it can help. So be careful about that. Don't just throw animations in for no reason. Usually it's the simple and the subtle ones that can make the biggest difference in your apps. And then be consistent. Like we were saying with this one, with the error animation, it's always consistent. If you get an error, it's going to slide up from the top and then slide down from the bottom. You want to make sure you're consistent with your animations and you're not just throwing like 50 different ones and they're unpredictable. The idea of animation is to provide a user with anticipation so they can tell what's going to happen before it happens. So what they know after doing this the first time that when it pops up and it goes away, they're going to know that the next time this happens, it's going to come up. So they're anticipating that and they're going to see that it's going to happen. So it gives them a sense of control and makes them feel comfortable whenever they're using your app. The fourth pillar, a little less relevant, but still something to keep in mind, is that if you're designing for accessibility for people who don't want to have motion in their apps, you should be able to turn that off. So this is another reason why you should be very careful about how many animations you put in your app, because if you put too many, it might be a hassle for you to manage those animations for accessibility purposes. So if you want to build things for people who want to turn off motion inside of your app. Okay, that was a quick overview, a little long-winded, but without further ado, let's go ahead and go back to the animation gallery app and go ahead and get started on trying to recreate this. So what we're going to do is we're going to switch over to Xcode and we're going to create a new project. So I am on my other screen. I'm going to click File. We're going to open up Xcode and click File, New Project. And then when that opens, here we go. I'll drag it back over here and we can hide. Well, I'll show you guys something in just a sec. But we can go ahead and click on App. Make sure you have iOS selected. So click App, click Next. You can call this whatever you want. I'll just call it Animation. And then make sure you have storyboard selected, UIKit app delegate, Swift, and then uncheck core data and tests. You won't be needing those. Click next. Pick a place to save it. I'm going to save it to my desktop, and I'm just going to create it right there. Perfect. Okay, so one of the things you probably noticed about the app is that there's going to be a background image. You guys can choose whatever image you want. I'll be using one I downloaded from a site called Unsplash. I highly recommend this if you guys need images for your apps that look really nice. You can search for literally anything here, and it's like super high-res photos. They're really, really nice. I highly recommend it. Okay, so I've already downloaded a photo, but make sure you guys grab one when you're ready. And the first thing that you're going to do, I'm going to hide my Safari so you guys don't have to see that. You can see I downloaded my image onto the desktop. So let me go ahead. The first thing that we want to do is grab that image and put it inside of our assets. So that way we can have it accessible inside of the app. Okay, so now we need to set up the user interface, which is the first thing that we're going to be doing. So let's go ahead, let's go ahead and go to our storyboard. And we need to go ahead and set up this interface. So the first thing that we want to do is we have this view controller. Let's call this is going to be the view controller where it shows animation view and that background image. And what we're going to do is we're going to embed this in a navigation controller. And what that does is it essentially lets us have that nice title at the top. So what you're going to do is you're going to click on, I think, Editor, yep, and then Embed In, and then Navigation Controller. Sweet. So let's go ahead and zoom out. Nice. Okay, so, and then we're going to toggle. There should be a toggle on the right for showing the title as large. Let me see if I can find it. I'm not really, I prefer not to use storyboards, but it's totally cool if you're using that. Let's see. Maybe it's in here. There we go. Prefers large titles. There we go. And then if we click that, it'll turn on and it'll show us the title. And then we can set the title for, this is the actual view controller we're using. So we can set the title for this to be Animation Gallery. Enter, and you can see it shows up. Okay, so we have the title set. Now a couple of other housekeeping things. We have to set this sort of background image that we want to have on our interface. So let's go ahead and set that in. So we're going to grab a UI image view. So click on the plus in the top right, click UI image view. Okay, and we're going to drag that in. And we want it to take up the entire screen. So we're going to set a top constraint of 0, bottom constraint 0, left, right. Everything is going to be set to 0. And then we'll add those 4 constraints. Perfect. Oh, whoops. This is a safe area layout guide. So make sure that when that happens, pull it back actually all the way to the top. We have to do this actually prior. So let's actually undo that. Sorry, we're learning as we go. Remove the constraints really quick. Oops. Live editing, that's how it works. Okay, so we're going to drag this image view all the way to the edges before we set constraints. And then, once we have it dragged to all of the edges, then we'll go ahead and set the constraints. And that way it'll stick to the top, right, bottom, and left. So let's open these constraints, activate them, and then click Add. Perfect. Okay, so now for the image view, we're going to set the image on that. And if you've already dragged your image into the Assets folder, it should be available in the tab. So if we click this, yep, we have the image. Great. Okay, and now the problem is it's not actually taking up the entire screen, so we need to change the image to not aspect fit, but aspect fill. Perfect. Okay, so now we have our background image. It looks nice and pretty. And then what we're going to do is we need to set up a few more things. So if we actually look back at the app, we have this pinch, right? And we have the background view, we have the title, and the last thing we actually need is this blur that happens in the background is actually another view. It's a visual effects view. So we need to add that as well. And then we also need to add this sort of UI view with the buttons on it. So let's go ahead and add those 2 things right now. So let's click cancel. Just to make sure our app is running, by the way, we always want to make sure you run it as you're developing, or else just to make sure that everything is going okay. So if we run this and then it opens up, we should have this nice view with a background. Perfect. Okay, great. So let's go ahead and go back to Xcode, and we're going to add in this sort of blur effect. So if we click the plus button, there is this item called, let me see what it was called again, effects view. Yeah, visual effect view with blur. So if we add this and drag it onto our screen, what you'll notice is that in the top right corner it says blur style, so it automatically adds a blur to this. So what we want to do is we want to make this the same as the image. We want to drag it all the way to the edges, and then we want to set the constraints on it. So let's go ahead and set those constraints. And what we can do for now, just so it's not like in the way so much, and we don't have to see it, we can set the alpha value to 0, and that'll basically hide it from the view. It's still in there. You can see it on in the left in the view controller hierarchy. You can see it still exists. We just set it to 0 so it disappears and it's not in the way. Perfect. Okay, so we have our visual effect view, and there's going to be a view inside of it, which is the blur. And then the last thing we need to do is add that sort of those 3 buttons, or those 2 buttons with that view on top. Okay, so what we're going to do with that is we're going to create a UI view. And this is something nifty. I haven't tried this before, but we can do it. If we drag the, instead of dragging it onto the actual view controller, if you go to the view controller's hierarchy, you can actually drop it like right next to everything else. So like in that view right next to view responder, you see the view pops out in front like this, which is actually really nice because then we don't have to like leave it on the screen. We can just edit it outside of the screen. Totally up to you guys how you want to do that, but this is fine. Just drag it into the left, and you can maybe move it somewhere that it might be a little bit nicer. I think that's fine right there. Perfect. Yeah, I think this is where we have to place it anyway. Perfectly fine. Okay, have the view there, and now we need to add our buttons. So the two buttons are horizontal, right? There's a start and then there's a cancel. So why don't we go ahead and add what's called a UI stack view. So this is going to let us put two items next to each other and space them equally. So if we look at horizontal stack view, so you can see it manages the constraints necessary to create horizontal or vertical stacks. So we're going to create a horizontal stack of these views. Perfect. And then what we're going to do is we're going to set some constraints. So I think it would be good if we just set some constraints of maybe 24 on all sides, just so it's even. And then we click add. Oops, the bottom got messed up. Let's fix that. So I think if you add a positive value to the bottom constraint, it kind of messes it up. I could be wrong. Let's just double check. Nope, it says 24. Okay, 24, add. There we go. Okay, so that was fixed. Now we have our little stack view. You can't really see anything inside of it, which is fine. But now we need to add the two buttons. So let's go ahead and grab two buttons from here. We're going to drop them inside of this stack view. Really easy. We can call this one, let's make sure to edit its properties and set its title to start. And then we're going to grab a new button. Let me zoom in so you guys, just so you guys can make sure you guys can see this. We call it start, and then I'm actually going to close my left part so you can see everything. We're going to add another button and we're going to call it cancel. Alrighty, and we'll call this cancel. And I think, so it looks like they need a width on the buttons. Perhaps, not too sure yet, one sec. Should be equally spaced. Not sure why that's giving me an error. Something's wrong with the constraints, we have to fix it, but I'm not too sure what exactly the issue is. So we have a left and right. Do we have a top and bottom? Nope, it's all good. Perhaps if it is spaced equally. Alignment, it's fine. Distribution, fill equally. Okay, there we go. Lovely. Okay, yeah, so there's a couple different settings for stack views, and for this one you want to fill equally, so they're both equally centered inside of the stack view. Perfect. Okay, I think that's, for the most part, that's everything we need for the animation gallery, like the first view. And now we can start hooking them up to the code. So if we actually open up the code and we do a split screen view, so we can click this button in the top right corner on the storyboard, and it'll open up the storyboard. And then in the other view, we want to open up the view controller. So it's a little skinny. It's kind of hard to mess with it, but I think if we close the right stuff and we arrange it correctly, we can fit it onto the screen. Perfect. Okay. But we need to see the view. Perfect. Okay. Kind of finagling this at the same time. All right, sweet. Okay, so now that we have our sort of UI set up, I think that's everything. If I want to double check. We also need the label that says pinch to view. So we add the label in there. We say pinch to view. Pinch to view. Okay, and we can make sure to edit that so it is the correct color and it's showing appropriately. So you guys can probably see why I don't like using storyboards, because it gets really cluttered really fast. but it's okay. Let's see. We have a default label color, that's correct. And it says pinch to view, but it's not showing up. It's probably because it is layered on top of something else, or the effect view is covering it. Let's see. Why isn't it showing up? Let's exit out of this, open this up. I need this view that normally shows up on the left. Huh. I'm looking for that hierarchy. It's disappeared now. Where is it? Whoops, wrong one. Maybe if I click back into storyboard. That is so weird. I don't know why it's not showing up. Maybe it's this. Ah, there we go. Sorry, it's been a while. Okay, cool. Let's add this, and then, oh, where did the label go? Ah, we accidentally put the label inside of the visual effect. We don't want to do that. We want to put it on top. And so we should be able to see it now, if I am correct. If we arrange it, there we go. Okay, so it's on top of the image, and we can see it. So then let's go ahead and constrain this to basically the middle. We can actually do the other constraints that let you horizontally center and vertically center, so it's dead center on the screen. A lot easier to see that way. Great. Okay, now we have our UI set up. Okay, so let's go back to the view controller and let's set this up like we had before. So we have all our UI components ready to go. And all we need to do is set it up so we can start editing. Okay, perfect. Let's close this, have our UI components here, and then we'll be good to go. And then now we can click on here and we can open up, close this, and then we can open up the view controller. Sweet, and we have our main storyboard. Okay. I need I need this stuff to keep showing up. It's too hard to like move around. All right, here we go. We should be good now. All right, let's start hooking up all of our components to the code. So we need to have a couple of different things here. The first thing that we need to do is we need to hook up each of these components to our code. So the things that we need to edit include the start button and the cancel button, as well as the the effect view and the pinch view, which is going to be this little thing right here. So it probably would help if we had this little thing on the left open, because we need to sort of access these views. It's kind of hard for me to drag and drop from the interface. Maybe not. We'll see. Let's go ahead and hook these up. So we're going to grab the start button, and we're going to hook it up. So we're going to hold Control and then drag from the start button to the code. And we're going to call this start button. And it's going to be an outlet. It's not going to be an action. We want to make sure we have access to the button. And then we're going to do the same thing for cancel. So we're going to Control drag, and we're going to do that for cancel. Cancel button. And then the last two things are going to be the pinch view and the effect view. So the pinch view is this entire thing. So we can drag and drop this and call it pinch view. And then the last thing is the effect view. So that's going to be inside of the actual hierarchy. So if we open it up, that visual effect view, we'll grab this, Control drag, right there. And then we're going to call it effect view. Perfect. Okay, we have most of the stuff hooked up to my knowledge. Great. Okay. Everything's hooked up. Let's go ahead and do some housekeeping. So the first couple things that we need to do are basically set everything up so it doesn't mess up, or set everything up to where it is in the beginning. Let's go ahead and run the app just to make sure that everything shows up correctly. Cool. All right, everything's showing up correctly. Now we need to go ahead and set up the interface inside of our code to make sure everything shows up nicely. So the first couple things that we need to do is to set the effect view to 0, which I think we did already in the storyboard, so it should be fine. But just to make sure, let's go ahead and add that code. So what we want to do is the effect view, we want to say self.effectView.alpha, alpha is going to be equal to 0. So that does effectively the same thing that we did before in the storyboard. This is just to make sure that it does it for sure whenever the view loads. Okay, so once we have that set up, we might want to apply some styling to this view up on the top, because it's going to look, I think in the normal app, the edges have rounded corners. So let's go ahead and add that as well. So we're going to say self dot, and this is calling the pinch view. So we're going to say self.pinchView.layer. This is going to access all of the layer information, the view information on this particular view. And it's going to allow us to make some edits. So dot corner radius, let's just set that to 20. So this is going to smooth out the corners. And then we also want to make the way that it smooths out the corners a little bit nicer. So we can say the same thing, self.pinchView.layer.corner curve. And there's two options for this. If we type dot, there's circular and continuous. This is just how you would normally do it. And then continuous, I think, is Apple's specific version of how they calculate the corner radius. It's really nice. But anyway, it just makes it look a little bit nicer. So that's done. We've added some styling to our view. Last couple things that we need to do are to style up those buttons. So the three things that we want to do is we want to add a corner radius. We want to set a border on the buttons. And then we also want to set the color of those borders. So start's going to be green and cancel is going to be red. So let's go ahead and do that for both buttons. So we're going to say self.startButton.corner or .layer.corner radius. Corner radius. It's going to be equal to, let's say 12, something like that. And we're also going to add a border to it. So self.startButton.layer.border-width. We're going to give that about 2. And then the last thing is we're going to set the color of that border. So self.startButton.layer.border color is going to be equal to, let's just say this is going to be green. So dot green, can we do dot green? We're going to say UI color dot green. And because this requires a CG color, not a UI color, we can just convert that by saying .cg color. Sweet. Okay, that's it for the start button. And we can do the exact same thing for the cancel button. So if we hit that and we go copy and paste it and we change all this to the cancel button, it's basically going to be the same thing, except we're going to have the color to be red. And always make sure you use system colors, guys, because the regular colors are, they don't work in dark mode is essentially what the problem is. But the system colors also just look better. So system red. Perfect. And the system colors are Apple's standard colors that they use. Okay, and the last thing. So we have all of our interface set up. It looks nice. But the last thing that we need to do is to do the pinching. So the way that we detect a pinch in iOS or any sort of interaction is through a gesture recognizer. And this is a class that's available in iOS, and there's multiple types. There's tap gesture recognizers, there's obviously a pinch one, there's hold recognizers. There's a lot of different recognizers you can use to detect a different type of sort of gesture on your screen. I think there's a swipe one as well. I've used that before. And so what we can do is right inside of ViewDidLoad, we can just create a brand new pinch recognizer. And so we're just going to call this let pinch recognizer is equal to UI pinch gesture recognizer. And it's going to take some parameters. First is going to be the target, which is self. And then the action is going to be a selector. So here you're going to type hashtag selector, and then we're going to pass in a function to this selector, which we have not written yet. But what we can do that right now. So we can actually just make a blank function just to insert it, and then we'll write the logic later. So we can say at objc, we can call it a name, say handle pinch. and then just make it an empty method, and we'll write the logic later. And then here we can say, okay, I want to pass in self.handlePinch. Great. Oh, and the last thing we need to do for this handling is to make sure that we put a sender inside of this. So we're going to type _sender, and that's going to be of type UI pinch gesture recognizer. And basically what this is saying, and we also have to rewrite this because it's going to autocomplete differently. Handle pinch, perfect. Okay, so basically what this is saying is that because we have, what is this error? Oh, func, forgot to write func. Basically what this is saying is that whenever the pinch happens, the sender is going to be that pinch. And you can access some data from the pinch. And we're going to be doing that inside of the logic. So let's say I do a pinch. And when I do that, this function is going to get called. And the sender is going to be equal to the data associated with that pinch. So whether or not, like how fast it was, or what direction it's going, stuff like that. So that's what's going to happen there. Let's see what error this is giving us. Oh, we will be using it, so let's just make sure that we leave that. Okay, and then the last thing we need to do is when we create it, we actually need to add it to the view, or else the view won't recognize it. So we can just say view, which is the view of the view controller, .add gesture recognizer, and then just pass in pinch recognizer. And there you go. Now you can detect a pinch. So now that we have the pinch set up, the next step is going to be handling the code for like actually animating the view. So we know what's going to happen on the pinch, but we don't have any code that's going to handle the actual like fading in and fading out of the view. So give me one sec, I have to plug in my laptop. So essentially what we need to do is write two functions, one that's going to hide the view and one that's going to show the view. So let's go ahead and write those really quick. And then whenever we do our pinch, we'll write the logic so that way whenever we pinch, it hides and shows it correctly. So let's go ahead and write this up. So we're going to have func show view. And we're going to have func hide view. Now this is where the nice animation comes into play. So on show view, we want the view to obviously show up on the screen, but we don't just want it to jump and show up. We want it to animate. And so what's really nice about this is, and what we can do here is we can use what's called Uiview.animate. It's in the animate function in iOS, and we can use it to make the animation look really nice and what we saw before. Okay, so how do we do that? Well, first, the view is not actually the one you can see on the right. It's not actually inside of the view right now. You can even see it in the hierarchy. It's outside of the animation gallery view controller. So it won't show up unless it's inside of the view hierarchy. So we need to add the view. So we're going to say self.add subview, self.view.add subview. We're going to add in the pinch view. Now that it's in the view hierarchy, it doesn't have any constraints. It doesn't know where it is. So we need to tell it where to show up. And so we can do that really easily just by saying pinchView.center is equal to view.center. You can see I'm using self in some areas and some not. It's really personal preference. Self actually helps you understand that this is a variable that's inside of this class, so stick to using that instead. So now the view will show up in the center. And then the last thing is that in the very beginning of the animation, you want the view to be disappeared, right? So we're going to set its alpha, self.pinchView.alpha is going to be equal to 0. So right before any animation happens, you need to put the view in there, you need to center it, and you need to turn it off, or you need to hide it. Then, here's where the animation comes in. So you're going to type Uiview.animate. You have these nice functions down here. And we're going to be using a really simple one, just with duration and animate. So you need to tell it how much time you want it to animate. For this, we can just do 0.4, and it's in seconds. And then you hit tab, and then you can define all the animations. So if you hit enter here, you'll have a nice code block where you can write all of the things you want to change, and then iOS will automatically handle that for you. So let's go ahead and do this. So we want the view to show up, which means we change the alpha. So self.pinchView.alpha is equal to 0. Self.effect view, we want the blur to show up as well, dot alpha, there we go, is equal to 1 actually, it's not 0. We want them to show up. And then the last thing that we want to do is the pinch view is actually going to be doing what's called a transform. So I think if you saw in the example app, when we do a pinch, let's try this. So if we do a pinch and then we hit cancel, you can see how the view sort of expanded but then faded away. So what we need to do to handle that, and you'll see why this is important in the end, is we need to reset whenever we're showing the view. It will be scaled. It will be transformed to this bigger size. What we need to do before we show it is we need to actually show it at the original size. And the way you reset that is by just saying self.pinchView.transform. It's going to be equal to cg-affine transform.identity. And basically what this does is it resets the transform for a view back to its original state. So it sets it back to a scale of 1, 1 in the x and y direction. Okay, that's our show view. Now we need to program the hide view function. So this is going to be where we do what we just saw when we click cancel. We hide it, and we also transform it, we scale it, and then we remove it from the view. So let's go ahead and do that. So the order is going to be like this. We're going to do Uiview.animate, and then also for 0.4 seconds, and then make your code block. And then the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to do this transformation, right? So we're going to say self.pinchView.transform, and we're going to call this a CG-affine transform. And then if you open up the parentheses, you can see you have a couple of options. For this, we're going to be using a scale, which is going to increase the size of the entire thing. So for this case, we're going to be doing a scale of 1.3 and 1.3, which means it'll grow by a scale factor of 1.3. That's the first thing that will happen. The second thing that we need to do is once it grows, we need to take off the blur and also hide the actual view. So we're going to set the alpha of both the effect view and the pinch view to 0. And that is essentially what's going to happen. Is it'll transform, it will set everything to 0, it'll hide the blur, it'll hide the view, but then we need to make sure we do something when all of this is done. We actually need to remove the view from the super view. And I actually forgot that there's another constructor. If you do Uiview.animate, there is another constructor that has a completion. So the completion will actually execute when everything is done. So if we tap, let's just say, we don't really need anything here. We can just put an underscore. So what's going to happen here is we can copy and paste our code in here. And then on the completion, when those animations finish, we want to remove that pinch view, the one that has the start and cancel buttons. We want to remove it from the view. So we're going to do self.view or self.pinchView.remove from super view. And this will take it off of the screen for good. Okay, we have our show view and we have our hide view functions. We should probably try and test these out. But before we do that, we actually have to make sure that our pinching logic is correct. So I guess if you wanted to, you could, on the viewDidLoad, you could call show view and we could see the animation happen. Let's go ahead and try that out. We've been writing a lot of code. We should probably make sure that our code's working. So it doesn't show the animation because it's inside of viewDidLoad. But you can see that the effects are happening. It's blurring the background and then it's showing the buttons. And I think from the looks of it, we probably need to make it smaller. So if we go back to the view controller, this is why you always run your code, guys, before you do anything. We should probably squeeze the stack view because it seems like it's a little too tall and it's making the buttons look kind of bad. So why don't we change that really quick? Let's select the stack view. And then we also need to add some spacing in between because they're a little too close together. So why don't we add a spacing of about 10, I'd say. And then we can go to the Constraints tab and actually change the top and the bottom constraints. We can make them a little bit bigger. So we could probably make this 42 or 48. Maybe that's a little too much. 36. You could also set a height on it. That would probably be easier. But 36 on the top and bottom seems to be okay. Let's rerun that and see how it looks now. Probably looks a little bit better, hopefully. Cool. There we go. That's much nicer. Okay, so we can settle with that. And as you can see, the animation really isn't working because it's not showing properly, but it is applying the effects. Because we're calling the function InViewDidLoad, and that happens before you can actually see the screen. So it'll apply all the effects before you actually see the screen. So you won't see the animation take place. So if we now see that it's working, which is great, but we need to have this sort of pinch functionality. So with that being said, and this video is getting kind of long, so I want to kind of speed it up just a little bit. We need to do the handle pinch logic. So with the handle pinch logic, you can do two things. You can detect when the pinch began and also when it ended. And then the second thing that you can detect is what direction people are pinching. So if they're pinching outward, there's this property called velocity, which will be positive if you pinch outward. And then there will be a velocity that's negative if you're pinching inward. And if we detect those, we can determine whether or not we want to show the view or hide the view. So let's go ahead and implement that logic, and then we'll end it with adding a button listener or a IB action to the cancel button, so we can actually like hide the view whenever it's canceled. Maybe that would actually be a good thing to do first. So really quick, let's just go ahead and control drag from the storyboard right above the show view function and change that to an action. And what we're going to do is we're going to call it cancel tapped. Perfect. And then the last thing we're going to do, excuse me, is we're going to call hide view when cancel is tapped. And maybe then you can actually see what the logic, or how the logic is working. So once that is set up and we rerun the app, you will see well, we took out that view. So let's say show view in InViewDidLoad and then run it. Cool. Great. And then when we see it showing, if we click on cancel, look how nice that animation is. So we can see that both the hide view function and the show view functions are working. You can't see show view because we're calling it InViewDidLoad, but we can see that that's happening. Now to make it all come together, we should do the handle pinch. What we're going to do is on the handle pinch, we need to detect whether or not it began, the pinch began or it ended. And so what we're going to do is we're going to set up an if statement. So if, and remember what I said about the sender is equal to whatever that pinch was. So we can say sender, if sender dot, and it's called, I'm trying to remember what it's called, state, I think, yeah, is equivalent to, and you can see all these options here, right? So you could see when it began, when it ended, all those things. So if we could say if it began or sender.state is equal to dot changed. So whenever it began or the pinch is changing, which it is happening all the time, we need to make that background view scale up and down. And so the way we can do that is by saying self.view.transform is going to be equal to self.view.transform dot scaled by. And this will scale the actual view by whatever factor we put in here. And what we can do is we can say sender.scale. And this is another property you can get from a pinch, is you can tell how much of a scale the pinch has been occurring. So if it's like this much, the scale is bigger, and if it's this much, the scale is smaller. And so you can sort of translate that to how much you want the view in the background to blow up or shrink. Okay, so we have that, and if we actually run that, we can see it happening in action. Pretty sure it'll work. So if we do our pinch, whoa! You can see there's a problem there, and it's because the scale is actually messed up. So, whoops. I accidentally closed out of Xcode. Okay. So that's because the scale needs to be reset to 0 every single time. But anyway, we'll get to that in the end. So otherwise, else if it's not began, if it's ended, if the sender.state is equal to .ended, or it's been canceled, either scenario is good. Canceled. So if it's ended or canceled, we want to do our animation. We want to either show it if it's been pinched out or hide it if it's been pinched in. Okay, so with that being said, let's go ahead and animate uiview.animate with duration. Oops. Sorry if you guys hear a buzzing. It's one of my phones. Okay, so again with 0.4. And then the animation that we're going to do here is we're going to set the view back to its original form. So when we are done pinching, the view, the background image, should go back to normal. So we'll say self.view.transform is equal to, and remember what we did last time, if we want to reset the transform, we just set it equal to cg affine_transform.identity. There's a lot of nuances like this in iOS, and it's just a matter of getting used to them. But they make a lot of sense if you dive in and you take a look. Okay, last thing. This is what I was talking about with the velocity. You can tell how fast and in what direction the person is pinching. So if sender.velocity is greater than 0, that means you want to show the view. That means you're pinching out, which means you want to show it. Otherwise, that means it's negative. You want to hide the view. Okay, so if we're pinching in, it'll hide the view. And then the last thing is that, remember what I said about that scale. Every time that you're pinching, the scale changes. And what you need to make sure is that every time a pinch changes, it resets the scale to 0, so it's a consistent pinch. And it's not like, you saw how it's super zoomed in, right? We don't want that to happen. So sender.scale, we can actually read what it says, by the way. So you can see scale is the scale factor relative to the points of the two touches in the screen coordinates. So that scale factor changes as you pinch out, but the thing is, every time you pinch, you want to make sure it's a smooth pinch, so you have to set it back to 0 every single time. Because this function, this handle pinch, gets called every time that you move your pinch, and constantly. So you need to keep resetting it to 0 so it's smooth. Okay, that was a lot, and I think we're pretty much done on this. If we run this, we can start to see our beautiful interface. Lovely. Okay, so if we go ahead and we hold Option and we do our little pinch, so if we pinch in, you see how it's nice and smooth now? Because as it's pinching, it's resetting the scale constantly, so it's a smooth, consistent pinch, and you can see we can pinch all the way out. All right, so if we let go, I was pinching in the positive direction, technically, so it animates the view. And then if I click cancel, it'll disappear. Now, what if I go in, but then I pinch in? You see how the negative velocity is allowing us to hide the view as well. Whenever we're pinching in the negative direction, we can also hide. Okay, congratulations, you made it through part 1. Part 2 is going to be a little bit easier. Now what we're going to do is whenever you pinch, and you click Start, it'll go to the tab view that we saw, and it will show these two new animations. So we need to do a little bit of work back in the storyboard, so let's go ahead and take care of that. Okay, so we can close the code. And then what I want to do here is we need to make a brand new, what's called a tab controller, UI tab controller. There we go. Tab bar controller, excuse me. So we drag and drop that here, and we, whoa, pop it down. Okay, this is another reason why I don't like storyboards. Okay, we have our two tabs, which is great. And now what we need to do is we're just going to make a segue in between the button and the tab bar controller. So if we control drag from the start button all the way to the tab bar controller, we can actually just use the show segue. And then whenever we click the start button, it'll show that tab bar controller. And then the other two things we need to do are, to set up the tabs for each one. So this is kind of minuscule, but I think it's still important to know whenever you're making a tabbed app. When you select it and you select the controls to modify it, you can change the value of the text inside of the tab. And what you can do there is say, you can call it, for this one, we're going to call it translation. Oops, wrong one. That's the badge. We need to say the title. There it is, item 1. So let's change the title. And then under image is the image that's actually going to show up. And one thing I really wanted to point out that I thought was super important is that iOS has a whole set of system icons that you can choose from. So your graphic design work doesn't actually need to be that much. You can just pick one of the pre-designed icons that Apple has to offer. Really, really nice addition. Let's go ahead and just pick some random ones, I guess. I don't know. Translation is like moving, so maybe an arrow would be nice. Let's see. Let's pick this zigzag arrow. I think I just saw it. There it is. All right, cool. So we have a nice zigzag arrow for our translation tab. And now we're going to have the second tab, which is just color. And then I don't know if I can find an image for this. Maybe I can. It's probably a waste of time, but it's all good. Let's do a little moon and stars, or sparkles. Yes, we love sparkles. Okay, great. Cool. All right, we have our tabs set up. And then the last thing that we need to do really quick is to make sure that, at least for one of them, we have this sort of square icon in the middle. So let's go ahead for the translation tab. Just drag in a UI view. So click plus and then save UI view. Drag that in. And you can give it whatever height you want. I'd recommend just giving it an equal width and height. So maybe 100 by 100. Boom. And then we also need to center it vertically and horizontally in the container. So let's go ahead and do that. Perfect. And then go ahead and set a just random background color just so you can see it. You need to be able to see it so that way you can work with it. And then you're pretty much good to go on the UI front for this second bit of the project. The last bit that we need to work on is actually hooking this up to code. So as always, let's double check to make sure our code's working. Run this and make sure we can, go to each of these views and make sure it works. So let's try the pinch. And then click start. Yay, okay, it's working. So we can flip-flop between the two. Lovely. Okay, so we have our UI set up for these two. Now what we need to do is go ahead and create some classes for each of these view controllers. So we need a class for this view controller to control the code, and we also need a class for this view controller to control the code. So what we want to do is you can right-click on the animation or your project folder, right-click, new file, and then we can call it Cocoa Touch class. And then here we're going to type in, let's say, translation view controller. Make sure it's a subclass of UI view controller, and then click next, and then click create. Lovely. Okay, so we have these two. Let's go ahead and split screen this just like we did before. Now we're switching sides because we want to spice it up a little bit. Okay, so let's close this. We don't need that. Okay, so now what we need to do is just make sure that we go ahead and create this second one, which is the translation. So this is the one where when we tap on it, it's going to, let's just demonstrate this one more time. Start. And if we tap on it, it's going to go up and down, up and down. It's going to change color randomly. And if we can go super fast, it'll just keep doing it. Okay, so with that being said, how do we set that up? Well, we need access to that view so we can manipulate it. So let's control drag from that view into the view controller. Oop. Very important thing I forgot. Whenever you create your class for that particular view controller, you need to make sure you set that view controller's class inside of the storyboard. So if you click on the storyboard, you click on the view controller, and you go to the class tab, you need to specify the class here. So if you type in translation, you can see it auto-completes translation view controller, and you hit enter. Now the code and the view controller are linked, and you can type code for that view controller. It's a very important thing. I overlooked it when I was first doing iOS development. It's hard to get used to, but you'll get the hang of it. So now we can control drag. Now you see it's working. You can control drag and then just call this, well, I don't know, animated view. Hook it up, ready to go. And then the last thing that we need to do is actually set up a constraint. And we actually already have the constraint set up in the storyboard, but we need to be able to manipulate it in the code so that we can move the animated view up and down, up and down. Now bear with me, I have to figure out how to do this because I haven't done it before, but I think if we go to the, click on the view, you go to the constraints tab, and you look at the align Y, so this constraint, and you control drag. I guess we can't control drag. Maybe if we right click on the view, we can access it. Interesting. See, I don't work with storyboards that much, at least not to manipulate code. So I'm not too sure. Again with this storyboard stuff. Okay, so if we actually look at the constraint in the storyboard on this sort of hierarchy view, if we look at the constraint in here, I think height width is fine, but if we look in these constraints and then we look for the center Y, which is this one, I think we can control drag from here. Yep. So make sure you do it from this sort of hierarchy view in the storyboard. So if we control drag and we say this is center Y constraint, call it whatever you like. This is just one example. Now we have access to that constraint, so we can now move the animated view up and down by resetting that constraint. Okay, now we're done with the storyboard. Now we can exit out. Okay, and so let's go ahead and sort of wrap this up. So the last couple of things we need to do here are to animate. Sorry about that, let me get rid of this. Last couple of things we need to do here. Oh, it looks like my video stopped working. Sorry, guys. Looks like it froze. Hold on one second. Let me see if I can exit out of this. Okay, maybe if I do file, new movie recording. Okay, now you can see me again. Okay, so let's go ahead and make this thing animate. So the first thing that we need to do in view did load is we want to sort of make sure that the animated view looks nice. So we can do the same thing we did before with the corner radius. So we can say animated view dot layer dot corner radius, and we can set that to 20. And then we can also do this sort of animated dot layer corner curve, make it look a little bit nicer by saying continuous. Okay, all good to go on view did load. We are done. And now what we can do is we need to make sure we can detect a tap. Well, on the Uiview controller class, there is actually a method that lets you do this. It's called touches began. And this will fire whenever you tap on the screen. So we really don't need the touch itself. We just need it to adjust the constraint whenever we tap. So this will detect a tap, and when that happens, we want to reset the center Y constraint as it goes. So before we do that, probably an easier way to keep track of this would be to use a property observer. And I'll write it out and then I'll explain what it is. So let's call this var const is going to be of type CG float, because that is the type we need for the value. And by default, we're going to set it to 150. But then inside of a closure, we're going to write what's called did set. This is called a property observer, which is just a fancy name for saying whenever this value changes, execute this code. And you can imagine if the value changes, that means that, hey, we need to reanimate this thing. So we can actually call uiview.animate, do our regular shindig. Here is maybe for half a second. And then the animations we want to do is we want to set the constraint, so we move it. We want to set the constraint's constant value equal to whatever this value is, const. So we're going to move the view. And then the additional thing that we need to do is say self.animatedView.background color. And we're going to set it to a random color. So I haven't done this yet, but I'm sorry we're jumping around a little bit. But we need to write some code that's going to let you pick a random color. So I'm going to write this out really quickly. If you don't know what an extension is, don't worry about it. It's pretty straightforward. It just lets you write some extra code for a class that is not there by default. So we can say static var random. So we're going to make a static variable so it's available through the class of type UI color. And then what we're going to do is when you use this variable, it's going to automatically return a random color. So it's going to say UI color, and then it's going to say red, green, and blue. And this is going to be just a random float. So cgfloat.random. And it's going to be in the range from 0 to 1. And we can just copy and paste this for all of the values. And then the alpha is going to be 1. So what this is doing is basically letting us call, let's say, uicolor.random. And what it's going to do is it's going to call this variable, and it's going to return just a random color and allow us to set that to the background color. Hopefully that makes sense. And then finally, once you have the color, in order for you to do an animation where you're changing a constraint, you need to tell Xcode, or the app, you need to tell the app, like, hey, if you need to lay out the view differently, go ahead and do that. It's called layout if needed. So it says lays out the subviews immediately if layout updates are pending. And because we're changing the constraint, the layout updates are pending. So it tells it to go ahead and take care of that. Great. I think that's pretty much everything that I can think of. Now that we have this, we can go back to what we need to do when we tap. So when we tap on the screen, what's going to happen is we're going to change, we're going to flip-flop this value. So we're going to say, okay, self.const is going to be equal to the negative of self.const. And every time that happens, let's say const is 150, and then you set it equal to negative 150, so it's going to go down. And then when you reset it again, you're going to say negative 150 is equal to, or you're going to say negative 150 minus negative 150, so it's going to flip it back to positive. And so it keeps flipping back and forth from positive to negative, which is why you get this up and down motion in the view. Perfect. I think we're all set to go. Let's go ahead and run this and see if it works. By the way, if you guys have any questions or get lost, feel free to leave comments on the video or contact us directly. I'm pretty sure we'll have some information for you. So we start it, we go here, and if we click, yay, it's going up and down, and it's getting a random color. Sweet. Okay, so we have the translation down, excuse me. That was pretty exciting. Let's go ahead and finish off with the color. So you guys probably guessed this one, based on what we've been doing, this one is pretty straightforward, given what you've learned in the past two examples. If we go back to the storyboard, we're going to need to assign, again, what we did with the class here, we're going to need to make a class for this one as well. So let's go ahead and make a new file called color view controller. Save that, create it. And then what we're going to do is hook it up inside of the storyboard. So if we go back to the storyboard, we click on the color view controller and we set its class to color view controller. Now whatever code we write will be attached to this view controller. Let's click color view controller. And remember what we said about this one. This one's pretty straightforward. Whenever we detect a tap, we just want to change the background color and we want to animate it. So if you remember from the previous one, which function or which built-in function from the Uiview controller can we use? You guessed it, touches began. So if we detect a touch, we want to animate the color to a random color. So we can say uiview.animate. Let's say about half a second. And then we're just going to say self.view.background color is equal to UI color dot random. You're probably wondering, like, hey, you wrote this part, you wrote this random thing in the other file. Why is it accessible? Well, you can see it's outside of the class, which means it's global. So any file could technically access this. I would, if you guys want to make sure you write code a little bit nicer, I would recommend taking this out and actually moving it to its own Swift file. So we can say new file, just a Swift file, create it. Oops, I accidentally just called it file. I can rename it, it's fine. We can call this random color. Doesn't really matter what you call it. Random color. And then we can just paste that in there just to keep it separate from everything. And make sure you import UIKit so it recognizes it. Okay, so with that being said, I shouldn't have any more errors. Type UI color has no member random. That's weird. It should be working. Perhaps we did have it in the folder for a reason. I haven't had to deal with that problem before. Maybe because it's set inside of this closure, which is why we need it here. Never had to deal with that before, but anyway, we can just put it back where it was. Normally what I do is I put my extensions in a different file if they are specific to that, so I can just delete that. Ignore. I can just put this over here, and I wonder, maybe because it needs to be in the same file so it can be accessible, and maybe that's the same scope. I'm not too familiar with like where certain things can be accessed in Xcode. I know there's some funny nuances to that, but ignore that completely. You can leave the extension at the bottom. If you want to move it into a different file, figure that out later. Okay, let's go back to color. And then this should be working. Touches began self.view background color equals UI color.random. And that's good to go. Type UI color has no member. Yeah, it does. Okay, so then if we run the app, it should be good to go. Lovely. So we have this pinch animation that still works. We click start. This cool animation works. It goes up and down, up and down, up and down. And then color, if we click, yeah, sweet. Awesome. So everything's working really, really nicely. Well, there you have it, guys. That was a quick introduction to animation. I know it was a bit long, but I think there was a couple of extra information in there, like the website, me talking really for a long time, explaining exactly what's going on so you have a good understanding. A little bit longer than usual, but hopefully you got some good info out of it. Hopefully you had a good experience. If you have any questions whatsoever, just let us know. Let me know personally. I'd love to sit down and walk through it with you guys. And don't forget all that other great information that I shared with you guys, I think right here, about the visual interface, the human interface guidelines for animation, this great website for high-res photos. And I hope you had a lot of fun with this project, and I'm sure you'll be able to make some amazing animations in your own apps using what you learned here today. As always, thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll talk to you guys later. Thanks.